So, let me then first welcome our first speaker this morning, Debbie Creamer, who is from the Iliff School of Theology in Denver, United Methodist, one of the first people to start writing from her particular professional disciplines about disability. Last year at the evaluations at the end, as you know, our challenge and our task these days is to connect the work we do in disability and theology with all kinds of other disciplines and perspectives. And people said last year, so that disability theology doesn't stand over in the corner by itself. And last year people said we really need to hear more from people who are coming from a feminist perspective around disability and theology and disability. And there's one voice for that, or the one who's done the most writing on that, and that's Debbie Creamer. And so let me welcome Debbie to us this morning, and I will hand out her handout as she gets started. Okay. Thank you very much. Help me welcome her.
Good morning. So usually when I start off this kind of presentation, I need to begin by making the case for why we should care about disability. I share statistics, I describe the continua and variety of disability experiences, I note the diversity within and between people with disabilities, and I remind us that it's an open minority that anyone can join at any moment. I also note that for Christians and folks with other faith traditions, statistics and arguments ought not even be a necessity. We are called to invite the blind, the crippled, and the lame, to do unto the least of these, to do unto others. For Christians, the parable of the lost sheep reminds us that even one left out is too many. And if none of those arguments work, I remind folks that people with disabilities are an untapped resource, a population that is underserved by church and other communities. So I say, if you're looking to increase your membership or your donor base, you might consider ways to reach out to the more than 54 million people with disabilities in the United States. Now, I'm fortunate today in that I'm speaking to an audience that already recognizes the importance of these issues, and so I can move quickly into the theological work that I enjoy. Simply put, my project is to try on the lens of disability and to ask what it means to encounter theological things from this perspective. Rather than starting with a story or image of God and analyzing where disability fits into that picture, making disability the second piece or the afterthought, my question is, if we start with disability, what stories of God then might we tell? So that'll be my focus here today, imagining some of what we might see and hear and encounter when we look at God through the lens of disability. To begin with, my sense is that our image of God here depends in no small part on how we make sense of disability itself. Although conversely, I think it's also important to recognize that how we make sense of or even experience disability is also directly related to how we understand God. So for me, those two are tied together. I've offered a handout that describes 3 possible models for disability and suggests images of God that might accompany each of these models. And so let me begin by a minute describing this. The cartoon side of the handout, which begins with a sketch of a person in a wheelchair facing a set of stairs to enter a building, and the ironic sign that says, "Everyone is welcome." This reminds us in images what difference it makes which definition or model of disability we use. According to the medical model, the problem is with the body of the wheelchair user, who is incapable of navigating a flight of stairs. The individual is impaired. The individual is the problem. This is the second image on the handout, which is a cartoon of a person with arrows pointing in at him, and the label, problem, problem, problem. An alternate perspective is offered by the social model, which suggests that the problem is the flight of stairs itself, an architectural barrier, as well as the assumption that anyone who would be invited or who would be welcome would be able to navigate these stairs, an attitudinal barrier. The problem is no longer the individual, but rather the barriers of space, language, and attitude. And this is the third image on the handout, a cartoon of the same person, but this time the arrows are pointing outward at the societal barriers. As I said, I think the models of disability we use affect the images of God we encounter in relation to disability, which is what I want to talk about together today. My sense is that even though disability advocacy has made great strides and minority or social models of disability have gained traction, I think the medical model is still the one we live and breathe in both culture at large and in churches and theological schools in particular. When I ask my students to define disability, particularly after they've been using that term comfortably for a little while, they give me medical or functional definitions. For them, disability is an inability to do certain things, a medical defect, a limitation, a loss. The images of God that come then when I ask them about God and disability, not surprisingly, tend to be ones that connect to this sort of medical image, or even predating this to a sort of a moral image that still leaks through, where disability implies something either good or bad. So within the medical model, God for them causes disability as a blessing or a curse, or God doesn't cause it, and it's just an accident, and that's the end of the story. My sense is that this sort of God, who either causes disability for a reason or who is utterly detached from it, is the God who appears in our hymns and our Sunday school stories, the God we see in pop culture and media portrayals, the God who appears far too often, for me at least, in sermons, pastoral care, theology, and the everyday life of faith communities. Now, the social or minority model of disability has led, in my opinion, to some really exciting new images of God. These images suggest that we don't have to think of God as all-powerful and in control of disability, but we also don't have to think of God as being out of the picture. Rather, these images begin with a sense that disability is a social experience, and so we are invited to engage God in ways that highlight issues of access, justice, and inclusion. Let me briefly share 3 examples with you, each of these located within the Christian tradition. The first image I'd like to share with you today is one I'm calling the accessible God. The accessible God. It comes from Jenny Weiss Block in her book Copious Hosting. Block sees the lens of access and inclusion as a useful one through which to examine our images of God. She argues that what we see in the stories of the Christian tradition is a God who is unfailingly committed to inclusion and access. This, she says, was the explicit message of Jesus, that all are welcome and that all have a place. According to Block, the New Testament account shows that Jesus included all people in his ministry, regardless of nationality, gender, background, or physical condition. Beyond simply being a welcoming host, her image of God is also one who is actively in solidarity with the oppressed, even to the point of partnering with people with disabilities in the struggle for justice and inclusion. Thus, if we are to be Christ-like, we must be profoundly inclusive, removing all barriers of architecture and attitude, and we must act as advocates for disability rights and related issues. This rests solidly on her theological commitment that the God of our tradition is one who is concerned with justice and inclusion, welcoming everyone to the table and desiring their full humanity, and calling us to do the same. A second image that I think draws helpfully on the social model is that of the interdependent God from Kathy Black, the interdependent God. For Black, the stories of Jesus, and especially the story of the resurrection and stories of early Christian communities, emphasize the ways in which we are all dependent on each other, working together to live out God's vision. Rather than allowing prejudice, stereotypes, ideas of perfection, or other artificial social barriers guide us, she proposes that we must begin with the affirmation that God is present in the midst of life and in the midst of suffering. God isn't at the top of that staircase, but God is present right here with us. Thus, she takes phrases such as the family of God, the communion of the saints, and the body of Christ to directly represent people who are interdependent upon one another and upon God, not only in times of crisis, but all the time. For Black, the experience of disability allows us to see or notice what is often invisible to others, that all people, disabled or not, are dependent on other people and on the resources of the natural world for survival. Black notes that this is a particularly difficult awareness within the context of American culture, which accentuates independence and sees dependence as something to be avoided. Black thinks that Christian communities can offer an alternative to this standard American picture, a countercultural story in a way, celebrating our interdependence rather than our independence. One of the most powerful and creative images to come out of the social model of disability comes out of Nancy Easland's proposal of the disabled God by the book of the same title. A person with a disability herself, Easland argued that traditional images of God, especially those that lead to views of disability as either a blessing or a curse, were inadequate. Within her own experience, she wondered whether such a God could even understand disability, let alone be meaningful to her own life. Serving as a chaplain in a rehabilitation hospital, she asked the residents one day what they thought. And this is a quote from her work. After a long silence, a young African-American man said, "If God was in a sip puff, maybe he would understand." I was overwhelmed by this image, she writes. God in a sip puff wheelchair, the kind used by many quadriplegics that enables them to maneuver the chair by blowing and sucking on a straw-like device. Not an omnipotent, self-sufficient God, but neither a pitiful, suffering servant. This was an image of God as a survivor, as one of those whom society would label not feasible, unemployable, with questionable quality of life. That's the end of the quote. Easland made a connection between this image and the resurrection story in which Jesus appeared to his followers and revealed his injured hands and feet. Easland suggests that Jesus reveals the disabled God and shows that divinity, as well as humanity, is fully compatible with experiences of disability. The imago Dei, or the image of God, includes pierced hands and feet and side. According to Easland, this disabled God is the hidden history of Christianity, because we in Christian communities rarely pay attention to the resurrected Christ as a deity whose hand, feet, and side bear the marks of profound physical impairment. As Rebecca Chopp notes in the introduction to this work, she says, quote, "The most astonishing fact is, of course, that Christians do not have an able-bodied God as their primal image. Rather, the disabled God, promising grace through a broken body, is at the center of piety, prayer, practice, and mission." That's the end of the quote. Easland relies on the social model of disability to show God's ability to be in solidarity with those who are oppressed. Easland's image of God also has specific characteristics that I find valuable. First, the disabled God rejects the notion that disability is in any way the consequence of individual sin. She sees the scars of Jesus as verifying this claim. Jesus did not sin and yet became disabled. The invitation to touch Jesus' hands and side shows that taboos against disability are to be rejected, and that shallow expressions of sympathy and piety are inappropriate. You wouldn't walk up to Jesus and say, "I'm so sorry for your scars," right? The shallowness would be inappropriate. She argues that God is in solidarity with people with disabilities and others who are oppressed, as this is a God who has experienced and understands pain and rejection, a God who knows disability not just as an embodied experience, but as a social one as well. Finally, let me close with just a few reflections on an additional model of disability that leads to still other images of God. This is grounded in my own reflection on how normal disability is, which has led me to propose what I call the limits model, a term that highlights that limits are an unsurprising part of being human. As I've said, my sense is that the first three models that I've described here, the accessible God, the interdependent God, and the disabled God, all draw on the social or minority model of disability, which highlights experiences of oppression and exclusion of a specific category of people. The limits model goes a step further, proposing that even the experience of living in the blurry world between disability and non-disability, as I do, leads to particular experiences about God. If we are made in the image of God, and many of us, or all of us, if we live long enough, experience some kind of disability, what kinds of new stories about God can we tell? If we start with the idea that disability is what is normal, and we are in the image of God, what stories then can we tell? Approaching our understanding of humanity from the starting point of disability, rather than some imaginary perfection, gives us what I think is a more appropriate and accurate vision of human limits. Human limits can then be compared and considered, but are not in and of themselves seen as abhorrent or abnormal. When you stop to think about it, it's not surprising to note that humans have limits. And yet this is something modern society seems to have forgotten or lies about. A second and related claim suggests that limits are an intrinsic aspect of human existence. Part of what it means to be human is to have limits. This, for me, reminds us of the writings attributed to Paul, where he describes how each member of the community has a different gift, and that no one on their own, but rather all of us together, is what makes up the body of Christ. Finally, the limits perspective implies that limits are good, or at the very least, not evil. Christians and Jews are reminded of the first creation story, where God saw all that had been created and said that it was good. And so limits are no longer something to be overcome or fixed in search of perfection, nor is the focus exclusively on experiences of social oppression. Rather, from the limits perspective, disability might be understood as limits that are not accommodated by the environment. And sin might now be redefined as ways in which we both exaggerate and also deny our limits and the limits of others. So here our image of God might be one that emphasizes creativity, a quality that often arises out of limits. For me, at least, it is my own limits of ability, of time, of energy, of resources that sometimes lead me to be the most creative. In this way, I might also imagine a God whose abundant creativity is also grounded in an experience of limits. Without limits, why be creative? Another attribute that draws on a limits model might be perseverance, engaging one's limits and not giving up. Yet another might be authenticity, neither exaggerating nor minimizing one's own capabilities. And yet one more might be relationality, knowing that we are only complete and whole when we come together as community. This model, I think, offers space for grief and loss, for longing and desire, for hope and imagination. These are characteristics that, for me at least, add depth to God in ways that resonate not only with my own life, but also with what I see in my relationships, my community, and even in the natural world. Within this model, our challenge then is to neither deny nor overstate our limits, nor God's limits. We cannot pretend that we are self-sufficient, nor should we give up and say we have no power. And perhaps the same is true for God. This means living between arrogance and despair. It also means striving for authenticity in our sense of self and in our relationships with others, and even in our relationship with God and our understanding of God's relationship with us. Rather than generating pity from the medical model or righteous anger from the social model, this lens also leads to a depth of individual reflectiveness as well as generative possibilities for community, emphasizing connection and interdependence rather than competition, separation, or hyper-individuality. For me, at least, it's a way to live into possibility and hope without negating or dismissing the messiness and pain of authentic life. In my opinion, these four models offer powerful additions or alternatives to traditional images of God. Each demonstrates that the idea of God is not incompatible with disability. And moreover, it shows that it's possible to argue that God is on the side of those with disabilities. Such models help explain to churches and theological schools why it is that they must attend to issues of justice, sending clear and unequivocal messages about the intrinsic value of people with disabilities. We are not a problem, we are of God. You do not include me as a favor to me, but rather because I am part of the goodness of creation. And you and I are not so different in this. The memorable image of the disabled God, as one who intimately knows and even experiences disability, is especially important. In addition to calling for change, it irrevocably changes the way one encounters the Christian story. How can one be a Christian and not value experiences of disability? The image necessarily leads to changes in understanding and in action. The limits model, I think, adds to this, reminding us that these images and insights are not only relevant to people with disabilities, but tell a story that resonates with, empowers, and challenges us all. Now, clearly, none of these models is sufficient alone. Each has dangers and limits of its own. We are reminded that the God who passes all understanding cannot be captured in a single image or metaphor, and our tendency to rely primarily or exclusively on a particular image will lead us away from the richness of possibility of other images. This is where I invite you to try on your own lenses as this week goes on, or to reflect on how it is that you touch and feel and move through the world. How do your embodied experiences help you tell new stories about God? What does your sense of God tell you about this life that you and we are living? I invite you to share these stories with each other and with your larger communities as we explore together what it means to encounter God in disability. Thank you.
I can't think of a better way to begin. Let's open it up for questions. We've got 15 minutes. Yes?
I was moving happily along with 3 models, and somewhere early in your presentation, 4 models.
Yeah, the fourth model is the model that I'm proposing is the limits model. So the idea that limits are a normal, ordinary part of life. So the 4 that I described were the accessible God, the interdependent God, the disabled God, and the God who knows limits. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Know more about how your limits model views the definition of humanity, because competition, dependence, and hyper-individuality is often what is being taught is how it's a result of many definitions of what it means to be human.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying that, well, what if we're to rechange, if the limits model will completely change how it is that we view humanity?
Mm-hmm.
So how do we, I guess, where do we go from there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is basically, in my field, that would be called a question of theological anthropology. So if we're used to thinking of the successful human, sorry, the microphone has some feedback there. Bill, can you turn your microphone off? I think that's okay. Okay. Is that better? Good. Okay. So within my field, that's a question of theological anthropology. So how do we make sense of what it is to be a successful human, or the question of human flourishing? What is it that we aim towards or strive towards? And at least within U.S. culture, a lot of the sense of that is on individuality, successfulness, competency, independence, and those sorts of things. And yes, in a way, the limits model turns that backwards. In part, this is my sense of commitments from other areas. So feminist studies, post-colonial studies, queer studies that are more attentive, I think, than mainstream culture in terms of this image that we're independent. In some ways, it reveals a lie. None of us are independent. Did any of you grow your breakfast this morning? Probably not. And if you did, you even did that with help. The room that we're in was crafted and built by other folks. Everything that we do is interdependent. And yet we tell this lie that we ought to be independent and that independence is success. So it's very much an inside-out space. It's inside out enough when we think about it for ourselves. When we try to imagine that for God, at least for my students, it completely freaks them out. You know, they want to think of a God who is all-powerful, who can do anything, for whom nothing is beyond God's capacity. And it's counterintuitive as well as disruptive in some ways to say, what would it mean to just try on, like just for 10 minutes, try on this idea of a God who has limits not as a defect, but as an expression of richness and fullness in life. So, yeah, in the back.
I've been struggling with the social model of disability also, and then I find our advocacy movements, our activist movements to be too limiting in terms of not allowing us to express any weakness or express any idea that we're not as good as non-disabled people and things like that. But I've noticed that although privately many of us within the advocacy movement do talk to each other and discuss to each other, that we know that model has flaws, I've not seen any movement away from that model until your presentation. Do you have, are you finding support within the established disability communities for your model? And if so, how can I tap into that?
The question was kind of, are there senses of frustration in the social model? And let me nuance it both in terms of within advocacy organizations and within scholarly or academic worlds. And I move most solidly within the scholarly academic world. And that's a space where I am seeing the frustration with the social model expressed more clearly. Leonard Davis is one of the folks who's done some really fantastic work in terms of saying the social model is useful up to a point, but doesn't successfully cover everything. For me, I'm someone who lives with pain, and so the social model would suggest that disability is a label put on me by society, and it doesn't mediate the fact that at the end of the day, I'm still in pain. So I think individually we're aware of that. At the same time, I don't want to push too quickly for letting go of the social model because, yeah, exactly, that's what we need so that we have ramps and so that we have accessible education and all of those other things. In the same way that I don't think we need to completely abandon the medical model, in part because I enjoy pharmaceuticals from time to time. So both of those, I think, are models that have some usefulness, but it becomes idolatry in a way if we get too stuck on either of those. And it'll be interesting as advocacy movements move forward, whether it's through building alliances with other folks or with recognizing this kind of messiness of the human body that then allows us to hold on to the value of the social or the minority sense, but also add in these other senses of what it is to live a more full life.
Got a question? Let's do it on a mic.
I would say I like the limits model too because it starts with our vulnerability and need for each other. The challenge is that many people draw comfort from the fact that God is in control and that there is purpose in this. I mean, I am this child's mother for a reason. It may not be as punishment, but it's because I've been so. Or someone with a disability too could feel God is at least leading me through this, or so that's how to walk with people in that mode is a challenge.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. When I give a much longer talk, I often start by reminding the audience that people with disability, just like people who currently don't have disability, have a huge range of understandings of God. And for some folks with disability or folks currently without disability, for some of those folks, the all-powerful, in-control God is the most meaningful one for them. And I don't mean this in any way to kind of diminish that sense of value and understanding. And for folks for whom that creates great meaning, I think that's wonderful. I also, though, my sense is that those models are there. The models of God as ally have been developing over the last 15 years. This God of vulnerability is a newer one, at least within the academy, as a story that we tell. And so to hold those together and to recognize spaces both in our individual lives and in our communal lives where different ones have priority or contribute to meaning making, I think is good. So thank you for that question.
Are you familiar with Joe Pinnell's little book about coming alongside people with disabilities?
No, I'm not.
He's a bishop down south in the United Methodist tradition. And it's a very helpful book for answering those kinds of questions because it lends itself to all those different perspectives and how to come alongside someone who is stuck or preoccupied with any one of those models of where God is in disability. So if you're looking for a resource, Joe Pinnell is a good one. And it will come to me in a minute, and I'll tell you, because it is not in my brain right this second, my disability.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a comment and then a question. You said that in the American model, which I assume you mean the United States model, that there is a push toward independence. But I just want to comment that I think that has to do with the cultural context. And there are cultures within the United States where it isn't the push toward independence, but a lack of assumption that people can be independent. And there's also a model where people are more inclusive because financially they don't have the resources or know where the resources are to move the person with a specific disability outside of their own community. So sometimes it can serve as a positive energy because people stay in the context of their own community and are learning to connect because that's what economics and that's what even religious affiliation provides them, or at least gives them that understanding. That just a comment that even in the U.S., I think we have to be open to the variety of cultural contexts from which many of us experience the realities of disability. And then my question is, your presentation, it's a fantastic presentation, but can you give some models that you and ILIF may be doing that some of us can use to bring these models into focus into our local church communities?
Thank you for both the comment and the question. For the comment, I appreciate your level of nuance. In part, those of you who are still here Wednesday to hear my longer talk, I'll try to bring some of that in, particularly the piece about culture, economic situation, and a post-colonial analysis more generally. And yes, I did mean United States when I said American, so I apologize for that for those who are more globally aware than I am in some ways. As far as the question goes, I might defer to the discussion groups and the longer talk, in part because I think this is something that we together can work on in terms of thinking about how to go beyond taking these models as something we just talk about as a nice conference talk or as a coffee conversation, and actually how we put them in practice. I know at my institution, we've gained some traction in terms of my students who all do field placements in local churches or community organizations. Just giving a sermon that tries on one of these models can then lead to further conversations. That still is at the level of talk, but at least it gives folks an awareness of how to introduce different models, and not just through a sermon, but through religious ed, through hymns, through putting combinations of hymns and stories together in ways that accentuate this vulnerability, not as just kind of a trite idea, but in really grounded, messy, embodied sorts of ways. But I would love to think together with all of you about more ways that we can get this into the real world, as it were.